Language is a powerful dimension of social existence and interaction. It facilitates communication among individuals and helps create agreement and consensus. It is, as such, an essential tool for advancing both knowledge and society. Nevertheless, language can be also a source of antagonism, misunderstanding, and confusion, and therefore has the power to undermine social harmony and to close the human mind. The impact of language on thinking and behavior is particularly noticeable when communication and exchange take place across cultures. Under such circumstances, the question of commensurability becomes relevant. The question can be posed as thus: can peoples with different historical experiences have a meaningful exchange of ideas? Given the fact that understanding the meaning of a term presupposes an experience of a sort of the object to which the term refers, the relationship between knowledge and experience gives rise to a series of questions with regard to understanding the grand concepts of religion, secularism, and liberalism, and the way each relates to the others. Such terms are not easily and fully interchangeable across cultures and civilizations, and misunderstanding results from extrapolating one's experience across cultures. Thus, superimposing the experience of a historically determined being on another, be it an individual or a community, is bound to stifle or even destroy the latter's chance to develop and mature. While realizing the above difficulty, I do believe that scholars in general and Muslim scholars in particular are duty-bound to explore meaning across cultures and civilizations, and to stimulate the exchange of ideas and experiences. As a Muslim intellectual who has had the opportunity to experience both Muslim and Western cultures, I do think that the two cultures stand to benefit greatly by learning from each other. I do also think that the future of human civilization is directly linked to our ability to learn from the historical experiences of Islamic and Western civilizations, and our willingness to build on the accomplishments of both. Although Islamic and Western civilizations appear to be far removed from each other at the level of structure and organization, both seem to share a common commitment to the universal values of social justice, equality, common good, social welfare, political participation, religious freedom, and a host of other common principles and values. Western civilization has perfected the structural elements of social life so as to allow a better integration of the above universal values into social organization. Western successes were, however, achieved by overcoming two major historical forces that are peculiar to the West: feudalism and organized religion. This fact has contributed to the erosion of the very moral basis in which Western Renaissance has rooted enlightened religiosity. Islam, on the other hand, is a tremendous spiritual force in search of modern forms. Historically, Islam is credited with building an outstanding world civilization in which science and religion and the secular and religious worked in harmony to advance human life. Can Islam play a similar role in restoring the moral core to modern life and arresting the increasing, immoral and irrational tendencies of the postmodern world? Many Muslim intellectuals would answer this question in the affirmative. The challenge, of course, is to reinstitute Islamic values and ethos into modern forms. However, for that to happen, Muslim scholars must reconceptualize the various spheres of knowledge and society in relation to Islam and its fundamental principles and underlying ethos. The efforts advanced in this chapter fall within the framework pointed out above, for I will focus in particular on the notions of religion, secularism, and liberalism. My basic argument is that a political order rooted in Islamic norms shares with the modern secularist orders its desire to liberate the body politic from narrow religious and cultural interpretations. Unlike the secularist order, the Islamic political order, however, encourages the fostering of moral values in accordance with the overall scheme of moral autonomy. I conclude by emphasizing the priority of the institutions of civil society over those of the state, and the inevitability of invigorating intercommunal action to ensure the autonomy of both the individual and community, and to limit the power of the modern state, although a deep understanding of the interaction between the political and religious spheres requires a systematic and elaborate examination of their meaning. I will limit my statement to delineating their boundaries and identifying a few areas of friction between the two. Religion refers to those aspects of life which relate to the determination of the total meaning of existence. It is concerned in particular with three grand questions about human existence: its origin, its purpose, and its destiny. Although the above three questions can be raised from a philosophical point of view, the religious response to them is distinguished from the philosophical by the degree of conviction that one enjoys over the other. That is to say, a religious conclusion to these grand questions is not only supported by rational arguments, but by emotional attachment as well. This difference gives religion an advantage over philosophy in that it makes religiously based convictions a better springboard for action. It is a fact of history that people with deep religious convictions are willing to endure greater difficulties and make greater sacrifices in pursuit of their religious ideals than those whose attachment to their ideals is based on purely rational demonstration. Paradoxically, though, religion's source of strength is also its source of weakness. It is always easier to dissuade people from erroneous convictions when the latter are based on theoretical arguments rather than religious convictions. Although shared religious convictions can create more harmony in the public sphere, the possibility of interpersonal and intercommunal conflicts are bound to increase in multi-religious societies. The question that we need to address here is not whether religion and politics stand in a conflictual or harmonious relationship, but rather how and under what conditions religious commitment can strengthen and improve the quality of social life. Politics is about organizing the public sphere, that is, regulating action and deciding direction. As such, both the convictions and interests of a people influence public regulations. In its drive to develop a social order in which religion and politics strengthen one another without suppressing individuality and creativity, Europe went through two interrelated processes: religious reformation and secularization. Reformation entailed a struggle to liberate the individual from the control of religious authorities, viz., the Catholic Church. Secularization consisted of the liberation of the state from control by particular religious groups, so as to ensure that public policy was based on rational arguments rather than religious injunctions. However, although religion ceased to have a visible influence in the public sphere, it continued to be an important force in shaping public policy and public life. This is true because rational arguments about the nature of public order have to start from a transcendental understanding of the meaning of public life and social interaction, the notions of right and wrong, good and evil, and the tolerable and the intolerable are the result of both religious conviction and political compromise. It is important to realize that secularization is a multifaceted phenomenon. One facet of secularization, and the one that was initially intended by its early advocates, is the separation of state and church. However, because it was achieved by negating history and tradition, it gradually led to the death of God, the erosion of religious values and convictions in Western society by the turn of the 20th century, and to the death of man at the dawn of the 21st century. The secularism of the postmodern age is ruled by the ideas of self-interest, self-indulgence, and excess. Secularism refers to complex and multifaceted attitudes and practices that cannot be easily captured in a brief description or rendered into a simple definition. While one may find certain similarities between modern secularist attitudes and practices and those which existed in pre-modern societies, it is fair to say that secularism as we know it today is a modern phenomenon that grew in the modern West and later took root in different societies. In its essential sense, secularism denotes a set of notions and values whose aim is to ensure that the state neither engages in promoting specific religious beliefs and values, nor uses its powers and offices to persecute religion. To prevent state officials from using their political authority to impose a narrow set of religious attitudes and values on the larger society, and to prevent the use of religious symbols to provoke strife among religious communities, Western intellectuals embarked on a project that aimed at separating political authority from religious affiliation. To that end, the Enlightenment scholars embraced a set of concepts and principles, and used them as the basis for reconstructing modern European consciousness. The new political ideology advanced by Enlightenment activists and thinkers emphasized concepts such as equality, freedom of conscience and conviction, and the supremacy of law, all of which were advocated by the religious Reformation that put an end to the ancient regime of Europe. The underlying socio-political morality advocated by the pioneers of the secular state in Europe was derived from the religious tradition delineated by the religious reformists of 15th century Europe, though argued in rational terms and common good logic. Early advocates of the separation of state and church, such as Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, had no intention of undermining religion or faith in the divine, but rather predicated their reformist ideas on the notion of God and civil religion. Descartes, for instance, argued, "The certainty and truth of all knowledge depends uniquely on my awareness of the true God, to such an extent that I was incapable of perfect knowledge about anything else until I became aware of him." Similarly, Rousseau, while critical of the way religion was traditionally taught and practiced, recognized the need, even the necessity, of religious commitment and faith for the modern state to function properly. He therefore identified a number of dogmas and argued for their inclusion in the civil religion that he advocated: the existence of an omnipotent, intelligent, benevolent divinity that foresees and provides the life to come, the happiness of the just, the punishment of sinners, the sanctity of the social contract and the law. These are the positive dogmas. As for the negative dogmas, I would limit them to a singular one, no intolerance. 2. Even Kant, who limited the notion of truth to empirical experience and labored to set morality on a rational foundation, insisted that without a God and without a world invisible to us now but hoped for, the glorious ideals of morality are indeed objects of approval and admiration, but not springs of purpose and action. 3. However, by denying the possibility of transcendental truth, and as a result of the relentless attack on the author ity of Revelation as a source of ethical and ontological knowledge, secularist scholars have been able to successfully marginalize religion and undermine morality. The efforts to ground morality in utility and cost-benefit calculation rather than truth have proved to be counterintuitive and futile, and have given rise to egoism and moral relativism. There were, of course, intellectuals who have less sympathy for religion, particularly among the French. Nevertheless, they did not represent the general sentiments of the great majority in Europe. Although the French Revolution displayed a clear anti-religious sentiment, it was not, as Nietzsche was to discover later, directed against religion per se, but against organized religion, represented primarily by the Catholic Church. Modern philosophy, being an epistemological skepticism, is, Nietzsche argued, covertly and overtly anti-Christian, although, to say this for the benefit of more refined ears, by no means anti-religious, for the original secularist sentiment was, therefore, rooted in the religious Reformation. More specifically, it was rooted in the Protestant revolt against religious hierarchy and centralized religion. Secularism was not originally intended as a way to separate religion from society or religious consciousness from political action, but only to isolate the state from the church structure and to separate religious and political authorities. The tone started to change, however, a century later among progressive European intellectuals, who saw in religion a negative force whose elimination they believed was essential for further emancipation and progress. Karl Marx, while agreeing that the secular state had successfully neutralized religion and banished it from the public sphere, still saw a great danger in religious life. This was because, he argued, secularism reduced religion to a private matter only insofar as the state was concerned. However, the privatization of religion gave it in effect more influence in the organization of civil society. Even in the United States, where religion has been domesticated and individualized to the greatest extent, it continues to divide society into distinct religious communities, thereby allowing for the formation of internal solidarity with a clear bearing on economic life. Religion, Marx further thought, was an instrument in the hands of privileged classes to justify social misery and economic inequality. In the Jewish question, Marx had the following to say about the need to emancipate humanity from religion: the decomposition of man into Jew and citizen, Protestant and citizen, religious man and citizen, is neither a deception directed against citizenhood, nor is it a circumvention of political emancipation. It is political emancipation itself, the political method of emancipating oneself from religion. Of course, in periods when the political state as such is born violently out of civil society, When political liberation is the form in which men strive to achieve their liberation, the state can and must go as far as the abolition of religion, the destruction of religion. But it can do so only in the same way that it proceeds to the abolition of private property, to the maximum, to confiscation, to progressive taxation, just as it goes as far as the abolition of life. The guillotine. 5 Nietzsche, like Marx, condemned religion as a negative social force responsible for preserving the meek and the weak, and hence weakening the human race. By praising poverty and glorifying the taming of the natural instinct, Nietzsche insisted, religion contributed to delaying the refinement of the human species. By giving comfort to the sufferers, courage to the oppressed and despairing, a staff and support to the dependent, Christianity, he contended, preserved too much of what ought to perish. 6. Unlike Marx, who saw religion as an obstacle to achieving universal equality, Nietzsche's rejection of religion in general, and Reformed Christianity in particular, was anti-democratic, directed against the egalitarian spirit it promoted, and hence against its failure to promote the order of rank, a hierarchical social order which he believed to be both intrinsic to humanity and desirable for social life. Many Muslim intellectuals insist today that Islam is an integral part of the state. The state in a society committed to Islam, they stress, is by definition an Islamic state, since political authorities are bound to Islamic law, which has a direct bearing on constitutional law. This has created confusion about the nature of the Islamic State, and has given rise to apprehension on the part of modernist scholars, who fear that remarrying Islam and the state is bound to give birth to theocracy. The confusion is, of course, not limited to outside observers and commentators who tend to extrapolate in their analysis from the historical experience of Western society, but also affects those who advocate the formation of a political state on the basis of Islamic values. The difficulty arises from the efforts to combine the principle of popular government with that of a state bound by the rules of Islamic law. This confusion is, in my opinion, the result of equating the political structure of the Ummah with the political structure of the state, and consequently confusing the functions of the Sharia with those of the state. This confusion is not restricted to obscure works. Rather, it is found in the works of influential contemporary Islamic thinkers. In his book Nazariyat al-Islam Wahidi Hai, Sayyid Abu al-Ala al-Madudi, for one, points out 2 kinds of objectives to be assigned to the Islamic State. Negative objectives, like deterring the aggression and preserving the freedom of people and defending the state, and positive objectives, such as banning all forbidden things which have been condemned by the Quran. 9. Madudi concludes by affirming the totality of the state's objectives on the basis of the comprehensiveness of the Sharia objectives. He writes, obviously, it is impossible for such a state to limit its framework, because it is a totalitarian state encompassing the whole human life, and painting every aspect of human life with its moral color and particular reformist programs. So nobody has the right to stand up against the state and exempt himself from the liability by saying that this is a personal matter, so that the state does not intrude. In brief, the state encompasses the human life and every area of civilization according to its particular moral theory and particular reformist program. So to some extent it is similar to the communist and fascist state. But despite this totality, the Islamic State is free from the color that dominates the totalitarian and authoritarian states of our age. Thus the Islamic State does not curtail the individual freedom, nor has it much room for dictatorship or absolute authority. 10. The above statement reflects the state of confusion that we have just pointed out. In a single paragraph, the author characterizes the Islamic State as totalitarian, likens it to the communist and fascist states, and stresses that no one has the right to stand up against the state and resist its intrusion into personal life. He then contradicts himself 2 sentences later, denying that the Islamic State may curtail individual freedom. Certainly, the assertion about the totalitarian character of the state is the result of mixing state functions relating to the Sharia as legal demon, with the functions of the Ummah concerning moral and educational dimensions. The distinction between these 2 kinds of objectives is thus of vital importance to prevent the state from imposing on the general public a normative order based on a narrow interpretation of the law. The Islamic State, it should be emphasized, is not an institution devoted to advancing the interests of the Muslim community, but a political system based on universal principles and one committed to maintaining peace, security, and welfare for all citizens, irrespective of their doctrines, religions, nationality, race, or gender. As will be shown below, the Islamic system in the past did not lead, nor should it lead in the future, to imposing a narrow and limited concept or a particular opinion on society. This is because the principle of religious and doctrinal plurality has been considered, since the very inception of the Ummah, a cardinal political principle. Here the Quranic verses, both the Maccan and Madinan, clearly stress the centrality of the principle of religious freedom in the Islamic concept. Lately, there has been concern about the relationship between religious commitments and the exercise of power among the ranks of Islamists. Mainstream Islamic groups have been gradually moving away from the concept of a centralized Islamic political order envisaged by early leaders such as Hassan al-Banna and Taqiyuddin al-Nabhani, leaders of the major Islamic movements in Egypt, Jordan, Pakistan, Syria, Turkey, and Tunisia, to name a few, have come out openly in favor of a democratic, pluralistic political system, in which freedom of speech and association is guaranteed for citizens, regardless of their political orientation or religious affiliation.